Hello, listener. Now, I recently held a poll on Twitter. Yes, I've made a new Twitter account. If you look around for Faust, you will probably find me. And I held this poll about whether I should do some science papers and analysis, kind of inspired by the idea of what teal deer does, but of course with a slightly different focus away from SJW and feminists and more into actual serious science that support sort of rightist politics, or if I should do a video about Theosophy and Blavatsky. And the poll came out 50-50. So that was very helpful, guys. Thanks very much. So I had to do the tiebreaker myself. So I still am probably going to do something about Theosophy, but I'm going to read more into that, so maybe in future. For the time being, I want to start reading some science papers occasionally, and maybe not even analyze them, just read them. And today I have Good Fences, The Importance of Setting Boundaries for Peaceful Coexistence, by Alex Rutherford, Diane Harmon, Justin Werfel, Shlomiya Bar-Yam, Alexander Jard Murray, Andreas Gross, and Janir Bar-Yam. First published in the New England Complex Systems Institute on October 6, 2011. I will start by reading the abstract. We consider the conditions of peace and violence among ethnic groups, testing a theory designed to predict the locations of violence and interventions that can promote peace. Characterizing the model success in predicting peace requires examples where peace prevails despite diversity. Switzerland is recognized as a country of peace, stability, and prosperity. This is surprising because of its linguistic and religious diversity that in other parts of the world lead to conflict and violence. You can see that they already implicitly have the assumption that diversity leads to conflict and violence. I think that if this paper were published today, these inherent assumptions would not be made here. If they were being made at all, they'd have to be backed up with quite a lot more data. Here they are just being asserted. And this was published in 2011, before this more pro-diversity leftist craze came into being, of course. Here we analyze how peaceful stability is maintained. Our analysis shows that peace does not depend on integrated coexistence, but rather on well-defined topographical and political boundaries separating groups. Mountains and lakes are an important part of the boundaries between sharply defined linguistic areas. Political canton and circle, swamp canton, boundaries are often separate religious groups. Where such boundaries do not appear to be sufficient, we find that specific aspects of the population distribution either guarantee sufficient separation or sufficient mixing to inhibit intergroup violence according to the quantitative theory of conflict. In exactly one region, a porous mountain range does not adequately separate linguistic groups, and violent conflict has led to the recent creation of the Canton of Jura. Our analysis supports the hypothesis that violence between groups can be inhibited by physical and political boundaries. A similar analysis of the area of the former Yugoslavia shows that during widespread ethnic violence, existing political boundaries did not coincide with the boundaries of distinct groups, but peace prevailed in specific areas where they did coincide. The success of peace in Switzerland may serve as a model to resolve conflict in other ethnically diverse countries and regions of the world. Little note here, they are taking Switzerland as a point of analysis here for inter-ethnic and inter-religious conflict. I think it's a poor example of that, since although Switzerland does indeed have both Protestants and Catholics and has Helvetians, French, Germans, and Italians within its borders, it's all white people, it's all Christian, so the diversity and the separation here is really not much different than across Europe in general. And it also has one single majority that kind of dominates the country, which is the German, the Schweizerdeutsche group, which is about 60% of the population and land area. The second biggest group being the French. And they kind of live completely separate from each other, especially in cultural spheres. The Swiss kind of interact more with the German-speaking world. The French interact more with the French-speaking world, and the Italians obviously are more oriented towards Italy. They all kind of live parallel lives, which is what this paper kind of asserts, that if these societies can sort of isolate themselves from each other and live sort of parallel and only interact on a minimal level, then that's fine. Then you can have sort of a diversity, but you need to have borders, and that's, well, the title of the paper, right? The importance of good fences. Anyway, continuing with the abstract. Achieving peace requires a vision of what it looks like. How we imagine peace affects the steps we take and our ability to implement it in diverse locations around the world. Does peace in one place look the same as in another? Is knowledge of the specifics of each conflict necessary to negotiate peace between ethnic groups in conflict? Even if specifics are important, there are broad frameworks that guide our thinking. Recently, we introduced the complex systems theory of ethnic conflict that describes the conflict in areas of the former Yugoslavia and India with high accuracy. In this theory, specific details of history, social, and economic conditions are not the primary conditions for peaceful conflict. Instead, the geographic arrangement of populations is key. Significantly, it points to two distinct conditions that are conducive to peace: well mixed and well separated. The first corresponds to the most commonly striven for framework of an integrated society. The second corresponds to spatial separation, partition, and self-determination, a historically used but often reviled approach. Basically, apartheid it would be an example of this second model. They don't say that in so many words, but well mixed is basically multiculturalism. Separation is basically segregated societies, like apartheid. Here we consider a more subtle third approach, that of the within state boundaries in which cooperation and separation are both necessary. The success of this approach is of particular importance as the world becomes more connected. As illustrated by the European Union, the role of borders as boundaries is changing. In order to evaluate the role of within state boundaries in peace, we considered the coexistence of groups in Switzerland. Switzerland is known as a country of great stability, without major internal conflict, despite multiple languages and religions. Switzerland is not a well-mixed society. It is heterogeneous geographically in both language and religion. The Alpine topography and the federal system of strong cantons have been noted as being relevant to coexistence. Their importance can be seen in Napoleon's statement, after the failure of his centralized Helvetic Republic, that nature had made Switzerland a federation. But the existence of both alpine and non-alpine boundaries between groups and the presence of multiple languages and religions within individual cantons suggest partition is not essential for peaceful coexistence in Switzerland. In identifying the causes of peace, the literature has focused on socio-economic and political conditions, including a long tradition of mediation and accommodation, social cleavages that cross-cut the population rather than coincide with each other, unwritten and written rights of proportionality, fairness, and cultural protectionism, a federal system with strong subnational units, a civil society that fosters unity, direct democracy, though through frequent referenda, a small size, a historical time difference between cleavage in language and religion, neutrality in international warfare, and economic prosperity. That's an important little last point there, economic prosperity. Well, that makes a lot of sense, right? I mean, of course you're going to have less conflict when everyone's well off. If you're all starving, you're going to be at odds with each other, whether you're of the same ethnic and religious group or not, because you're fighting for resources. Carrying on. Geography plays an unclear, presumably supporting role in these frameworks. The analysis of coexistence in Switzerland is also part of a broader debate about whether social and geographical distribution of groups in Switzerland, based solely upon the hypothesis that spatial patterns formed by ethnic groups are predictive of unrest and violence among them. The theory asserts that highly mixed regions or well-segregated groups are peaceful, while groups of a certain intermediate geographical size are likely to engage in violence. While effective separation may be achieved when group areas are large enough, the model also allows that topographic or political boundaries may serve as separations to promote peace. Using the case of Switzerland, we test the ability of the theory to predict peaceful coexistence in the context of internal country boundaries. Where explicit boundaries do not exist, such as in mixed cantons where alpine boundaries are absent, violence might be expected, and the results of the model in these areas serves as a particularly stringent test of the theory. In most cases, violence is not predicted, consistent with what is found. In one area, a significant level of violence is predicted, and violence is actually observed. The analysis sheds light on the example of Switzerland as a model for peaceful coexistence. The former Yugoslavia serves as a contrasting example of widespread violence. The theory correctly identifies areas of conflict and areas of peace also in the former Yugoslavia. The precision of the results provides some assurance of the usefulness of the theory in planning interventions that might promote peace in many areas of the world. The geographical distribution theory considers type separation into a geographical domain independent of the specification of the individual type. A universality of type behavior in collective violence. Violence arises due to the structure of boundaries between groups, rather than as a result of inherent conflicts between the groups themselves. I find this a little strange assertion. In this approach, diverse social and economic causal factors trigger violence when the spatial population structures creates a propensity to conflict, so that spatial heterogeneity itself is predictive of local violence. The local ethnic patch size serves as an order parameter, a measure of the degree of order of collective action, to which the other aspects of behavior are coupled. The importance of collective behavior implies that ethnic violence can be studied in the universal context of collective dynamics, where models can identify how individual and collective behavior are related. This is typical of papers. You have a thesis and you try to fit everything within the model of your thesis. So the thesis here is everything is geographical, and therefore everything has to be within the parameter of the thesis of geography being the cause for conflict. So therefore they disregard other causes for conflict. That's not unusual for papers to do. I think there's something of a truth in here, though, in that when people feel that they don't have enough space to self-actualize, whether that's like a home or collectively as a group, a town, a country, it makes sense that geography is one of the causes for conflict, and that having strong borders and knowing where your area of influence ends and that of another begins is important to avoid conflict and also to basically have a sense of security. That makes sense. But to assert that it's all geographical is of course taking it too much to an extreme. There are other causes for conflict. Conflict is always the result of many factors. Continuing. The analysis is applicable to communal violence and not to criminal activity or interstate warfare. In highly mixed regions, groups of the same type are not large enough to develop strong collective identities, or to identify public spaces as associated with one or another culture group. Interesting. They're basically saying that if multiculturalism is actually multicultural enough, and that there, in say a town of 100 people, there are no more than 10 individuals of any given group, then there are simply not a large enough group of people for people to start forming a collective identity, therefore always being individualized, and thus you cannot get conflict because there's no groups for group conflict to arise. And that makes sense. But the thing is, in any large enough society, eventually you have an N of enough people to form collective groups, and at any rate, even if ethnic groups aren't formed, there will always be cultural groups formed, because people select in groups and eventually they develop groups. So say you take a completely individualized group of people, 100 people of 100 different ethnicities, give it a long enough timeline, you will see conflict between them arise, because some of them will have become like, some have developed some subculture or one religion or another, and they will want to impose their ideas on others, or have found ideas others have intolerable. So, in-groups will form eventually anyway, even if you don't have the ethnic component to it, or the pre-existing religious one. For example, imagine, I don't know, you've got 100 people in this village, no ethnic identity, but they all, like, one group enjoys a video game, and another group doesn't. Eventually you'll have conflict over that. That might be limited to verbal conflict, but religion starts somewhere as well, right? So eventually anything can develop into being taken far too seriously and develop into serious violence, especially if there's no other greater concerns. Carrying on. They are neither imposed upon nor imposed upon other groups and are not perceived as a threat to the cultural values or socio-political self-determination of other groups. Partial separation with poorly defined boundaries fosters conflict. Violence arises when groups are of a geographical size that they are able to impose cultural norms on public spaces, but where there are still intermittent violations of these rules due to the overlap of cultural domains. When groups are larger than the critical size, they typically form self-sufficient entities that enjoy local sovereignty. Nations, in other words. Hence, we expect violence to arise when groups of a certain characteristic size are formed, and not when groups are much smaller or larger than this size. The model of violence depends on the distribution of the population, and not on the specific mechanism by which the population achieves this structure, which may include internally or externally directed migrations. By focusing on the geographic distribution of the population, the model seeks a predictor of conflict that can easily be determined by census. Basically, again, trying to fit, they basically want to find which number of people it is of a certain group that you need to have before conflict arises. Basically trying to, again, fit all of reality within this model. This may work well because geography is an important aspect of the dimensions of social space and other aspects of social behavior, i.e., isolationism, conformity, as well as violence, are correlated to it. Physical boundaries, such as mountain ranges and lakes or national and subnational political boundaries that establish local autonomy may prevent the violations of cultural norms and enable self-determination, inhibiting the triggers of violence. Basically, separation means peace. Because everyone then, if you don't come into contact with other people to have conflict with, and everyone agrees with your point of view, you're not going to be having a conflict over that point of view, right? It's obvious. By creating autonomous domains of activity and authority, the boundaries shield groups of characteristic size from each other when they correspond with their geographical domains. The term characteristic size here is meant as whichever n number it is that is enough to start forming an in-group preference. That's the term characteristic size. It's the thing that science papers often do. They take a certain term, define it within their study, and then repeat the use, and it has that specific definition within the paper. Mathematically, evaluation of the model begins by mapping census data onto a spatial grid. We included the fraction of every population type on each site. The expected violence is determined by detecting patches consisting of islands or peninsulas of one type surrounded by populations of other types. These features are detected by pattern recognition using the correlation of the population for each population type with a template that has a positive center and a negative surround. The template used is based on a wavelet filter. Wavelets are designed to obtain a local measure of the degree to which a certain scale of variation, wavelength, is present. Outcomes are highly robust, and other templates give similar results. The diameter of the positive region of the wavelet, i.e. the size of the local population patches that are likely to experience violence, is the only essential parameter of the model. The parameter is to be determined by agreement of the model with reports of violence, and results were robust to varying the parameters across a wide range of values. To model the effective boundaries, we assume that separate autonomous regions can be analyzed by including only the populations within each of the autonomous areas to determine the expected violence. Where boundaries are incomplete, as might be the case for mountains, lakes, and convoluted political boundaries, we include only the populations that are in line of sight through gaps or past ends of boundaries to determine the expected violence within the region. An effective map of populations at each site is constructed, determined by the orientation of any boundaries relative to that site. Populations past boundaries of the line of sight are replaced by neutral population. The result of the correlation of the population with the wavelet filter is a single value at every location, the theoretical propensity to violence. And the locations of expected violence are obtained by applying a threshold to that value. This is all methodology, it's not very interesting, but I'll continue reading anyway. The location of groups of a certain size is indicative of a violence-prone group, but the precise location of violence is not determined. The proximity of these violence-prone groups to actual violence is tested by constructing proximity maps. The proximity to the reported violence is correlated by the proximity to violence-prone groups. The model was validated without the boundaries by applying it to former Yugoslavia, yielding correlations of up to 0.89. The results were robust, to varying the characteristic length between 18 to 60 kilometers. Our revised method, with fractional population values on every site, gave similar results with correlations of up to 0.87. Methods are further described in the appendix. We now consider the linguistic and religious groups in Switzerland, each in turn. Initial analysis and the sequence of historical boundary formations suggested considering topographical barriers when discussing language groups and political barriers when considering religious groups. The geography of languages primarily reflects the extent of invasions prior to existence of current political boundaries and has remained stable in most areas for over 1,000 years. The modern state was established afterward, which is actually the case for pretty much every state in the world. The ethno-religious groups that were there pre-existed it. It's it's a little weird thing, but most people view the emergence of states as sort of a sudden emergence out of nothing, as if the nation state came falling out of the sky. But what nation states actually are simply the ultimate coalescence of the process of organizing by a tribe. Nations, pretty much always up until the modern era, have been built by one ethnicity, the exception being empires, where there's one ethnicity conquering others and dominating them. But nation states are pretty much by definition ethnically homogeneous. Now, the piece goes into a study of Switzerland, how Switzerland is divided geographically, culturally, etc., etc. I'll put the graphs they use in the video, but really, if you want to learn more about Switzerland, I guess open up the Wikipedia page and look up the history and culture of Switzerland or something. Now, to go to Yugoslavia, we carry on. They apply the same model to Yugoslavia, blah blah blah. To proceed to the conclusion. This work is part of a broader effort to use new methods for quantitative analysis of patterns of violence and their prevention. There is also interest in ethnic group interactions across national borders. We have shown that groups that are not well mixed but are geographically separated by natural political boundaries into autonomous domains are peaceful in both Switzerland and the former Yugoslavia. Our work clarifies the ambiguities of mixed language and religion Swiss cantons have by showing that in most cases the natural geography of the population conspires to lead to a lower level of violence, so that additional boundaries were not necessary. Where they were needed, as in Graubünden, they were established. The highest calculated propensity to violence is between linguistic groups in the northern part of the canton of Bern, where historically unresolved real-world tensions actually do exist. Our analysis indicates that both administrative and natural barriers can play a significant role in mitigating conflict between religious and linguistic groups. Historical evidence suggests that for religious groups, the boundaries in Switzerland were created to provide autonomy to a group with a shared identity and avoid conflict among multiple groups. Ongoing efforts to reduce tensions in Bern include introducing new political boundaries. The many political, social, and economic factors that play roles in reducing violence build on a strong foundation of geographical borders. Our analysis suggests that when partition within a country is viewed as an acceptable form of conflict mitigation, such partition can give rise to highly stable coexistence and peace. What's this paper really about? Well, it's basically saying good borders make good neighbors. Or good fences make good neighbors, really. That's the saying, I think. And it backs that up by creating a predictive model of geographically based separation. So the general idea is if there's rivers and mountain ranges separating peoples, there will be less conflict because these are natural barriers. These natural barriers shape nations and ethnic groups, cultural groups, But when cultural groups intermingle and they are of sufficient size and there's no barrier, then it's likely to result in violence, which is what happened in Yugoslavia, according to them. Except in places where, for example, there was rivers separating, say, the Serbs and the Croats, and there was less violence simply because they were separated. And that doesn't just mean that they can't reach each other, but that also, since there's that separation and historically that creates a different perception of the space around them, then you have less conflict. I'll post a link to the paper in the video description. It's really not that remarkable. It's just another paper confirming that people like being among their own. They don't really like people that are different from them too much, and that if they come into contact with people who are too different from them too often, well, then you're going to have violence. And the other option is that you mix people in so much that there is no possibility of there being sufficient people to form an in-group, which is of course kind of what the aim of modern multiculturalist leftists is, but that's not really possible because people hold on to their identities, people coming into large groups, the original native population get agitated, and they per definition always have a sufficient in-group to start conflict. So this paper just basically supports the assertion that keeping people separate, segregation, is better than trying to integrate everyone together and force them to live together. It's kind of the conclusion I take from this paper.